Up until this point, you've given us a good behind the scenes of all the different money being exchanged and, the unethical practices. I'm curious now to go back to the beginning. How did all this start? How far back does it go? Like, I'm picturing back in the 1950s, and you mentioned smoking before and the whole situation. And I think you use that as an analogy for what we're going through now and the topic we're discussing today. But when it comes to pharmaceuticals and food and this influence we're getting from the top down, when did that begin?
Yeah, great question. So on the medical side, which set the tone for food. Well, let me just start this way. The fundamental thesis is that there's a devil's bargain that's happened in the past 120 years where food is becoming cheaper and more addictive, making us sicker, which is in the food industry's interest. You'd expect the medical system to ring the alarm bells on that, but the medical system actually implicitly wants that because the food making us sicker, more depressed, more infertile, et cetera, makes the medical system money. So they've stood silent and profited and washed their hands of why people are getting sick. That's the devil's bargain. It started in 1909 when medicine was the Wild West. In 1909, the fourth most prescribed drug in the country was heroin. So heroin was a name and a brand of a drug patented by Bayer, the aspirin maker. And heroin was prescribed to nearly every baby in the country. So heroin, you can't make this up, but heroin was a patented trademark by Bayer for a drug for infants to cure finicky behavior. So every baby in 1900, when they were crying a little bit too much, their parents gave them a drop of heroin, which marketed on the bottle that was totally safe for babies. So we were kind of in the Wild West. And there was a lot of witch doctors and stuff like that. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, started the modern pharmaceutical industry looking for uses of oil byproducts and was the first big pharmaceutical baron. And he, in order to sell pharmaceuticals, funded modern medical education. So he was the big grantee to Johns Hopkins and other early medical schools and sought to create a medical system of evidence-based medicine that essentially siloed diseases into different categories where doctors could either do surgeries or prescribe drugs. This was a radical concept at the time. At the time, actually, medicine was more holistic. And the predominant medical theory was actually holistic, or things being connected. He said, that's totally wrong. We need to identify the condition and prescribe a drug for it. And he funded Johns Hopkins, which created the modern medical education system of residency, of the different silos of specialties that doctors go into. So that was John Rockefeller's brainchild as an express, not again, to help the American people be healthier. It was to sell pharmaceutical drugs. That framework then was written by his lawyer's last name was Flexner, was an employee of Rockefeller's who created and just basically gave Congress the Flexner Report in 1909, which established evidence-based medicine as the only type of medicine that the U.S. government would fund and propagate. So there was actually a big debate. Should it be holistic? Should it be... So that was created by him. Okay, so we get a little bit more of a structured medical system, but still, until World War II, every single pharmaceutical product was something that you took for a finite period of time. So, then we get into antibiotics, and all the pills are things, okay, you've got a condition, take this, you're cured, you're done. After World War II, when medical trust was at its height because antibiotics were actually credited a lot with winning World War II, we had the birth control pill in the late 1950s. And that was the first chronic condition pharmaceutical product ever. So the birth control pill was the first pill in American history that somebody didn't stop taking. And what a lot of medical leaders saw is that's a good business model. And actually, the Sackler family. I believe his name is Mortimer Sackler, who was the grandfather of the folks that did the opioid stuff later on, a father and grandfather. He worked for Pfizer in the 1950s and 1960s, saw the birth control pill, and he started asking, how can we create more chronic issues? So his first big thing was Valium. And Valium in the 1960s into the 1970s became the most popular drug in the country. Over 30% of women in the late 1960s into the 1970s were on Valium. And they ran ads in Time and Life saying, if you're fed up with your husband, take a happy pill and you'll be fine. Like, it was very sexist advertising, really a strategy led by the Sacklers to get people hooked on Valium. And then it just started exploding. So the Sacklers, right, they actually ran the largest chain of medical journals. So they started this whole thing where they pumped things in the medical journals, and they actually just were able to lobby the government, who they were on the payroll to create new disease categories. So they created the disease category of menopause. Literally, that was a thing, and they created drugs for that. They created the disease category of anxiety and created drugs for that. So they started chipping away into siloing diseases and creating drugs for that, and had huge impact over the medical system, taking the trust engendered post-World War II on acute solves and asking to extend that trust to chronic. In 1960, almost 0% of the US healthcare budget was on chronic conditions. Today, it's over 90%. So we shifted everything to chronic. We had miracles before World War II in medicine, emergency surgical procedures, as I said, things to cure things that were going to kill you right away. The post-World War II chronic disease empire has grown the healthcare industry substantially, but been an abject failure. And that is the point that I'm basically devoting my life to. We have to wind that back. My sister graduating Stanford Med School and having to choose between 1 and 42 specialties under a system that was created by John D. Rockefeller in a corrupt way in 1909, that law has not been changed to this day. The Flexner Report literally is the standard by law of American medicine today. That is wrong. The body is not 42 individual parts. My sister was a head and neck surgeon and just had to pass out below her table again and again and again where she cut out their sinus infections. She did not ask, or was not trained to ask, whether that sinus infection that she kept having to cut out for the same patients again and again was potentially that inflammation that led to that infection was related to the fact that every single patient she had under her knife had diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, and many other comorbidities. There's no connections. That was built by design because a patient that sees an endocrinologist for their diabetes, that sees their cardiologist for their heart, that sees their psychiatric person for their SSRIs, which they inevitably are on if they have all these comorbidities, that sees their head and neck surgeon for their inflammation on their sinuses. That's a profitable patient. That's what Rockefeller designed. So when I talk to lawmakers, the problem with healthcare is not page 205 of the Medicare Part D law of changing this policy slightly. The problem is that the incentives of the system itself are propagated for us to be sick and to silo diseases into these fake categories. It is a fake thing to say to a patient with diabetes and cardiovascular issues and high blood pressure that they have 3 different issues. That is just medically actually a negligent thing to tell. It's the same thing. But every doctor that graduates from Harvard Med School, Stanford Med School, and every top med school in the country does not understand that. So anyway, that's how I see how we built this system. I think it's very, very clear and very deliberate structure that's been set up that few people understand and we need to understand.
Oh, that was interesting. Really important. And as you share that, the depth of how far back all this goes and the amount of money, the amount of corruption involved, it gets me thinking about coming back to earlier we talked about solutions, and I want to end with that. If we get to a place where people by default are understanding what you're talking about today with chronic disease, and we are getting to the root of it, and we change the way medicine works, and and the whole ripple out effect that'll happen, is there a way to do that without totally collapsing our whole system? And there might not be anything wrong with that. I haven't thought out the implications of all that, but is there a way, because there is so much money now and so many different players, can we get out of this without total collapse?
Well, collapse of what?
Well, just when you hear the different involvement of big food, big pharma, universities, scientific journals, and the whole medical system, there's so many players and so much money. If all of a sudden, again, I want to get to this, talk about some of the ways we can correct metabolic health, which are pretty simple. So if we continue, people like me, to push this message and make it simple for people, and they start to fix their metabolic health and don't rely on medicine, there's going to be a huge ripple out effect in the whole economy and the way everything is currently flowing, because there is so much money and so many people involved that are relying on one another. So like, if that happens and we figure our way out of this and we're using medicine for what it's good at, which is acute care, how does that keep the system from totally like, can we keep the system from not collapsing?
Yeah, well, I think it's the biggest issue we face in the country. I think if you look 50 years in the future, and if you assume the American experiment ends, I don't think it's going to be because we had the wrong level of marginal military spending. It's not going to be because of kind of the latest controversy, frankly, even social justice issue written about in the papers. It's not going to be because of all the other trivia that's being discussed on cable news or in Congress, quite frankly. The number one reason for the American experiment failing will be because we let our population get sicker, fatter, more depressed, more infertile. Infertility is a huge issue, by the way. It's sperm count's down 50%, PCOS is skyrocketing. Our bodies are losing the ability to reproduce at a pretty alarming rate. It's going to be because we let that happen while bankrupting our country with healthcare costs. And just to answer your question, but let's just set the table here. I think we talk about healthcare costs so much that our eyes gloss over, but 20% of GDP, growing at double the rate of GDP, producing worse outcomes for American human capital, American health, for each dollar that we contribute more to it. It's going to be 40% of GDP in 15 years, right? So it truly is, it is on an unsustainable trajectory. It's getting worse. And by definition, it's unsustainable and will have to change because it will bankrupt the country. That's not that's just the math. So if you agree it's unsustainable, it has to change at some point. And the only way to change it, I think, is a dismantling of the system, because we're not going to drug our way out of this problem. We're not going to try to over-engineer and hack America or our human biology and our fertility and our metabolic health, which is millions of years in the making and we have no compensation of whatsoever, has brought us to this point and is not going to get us out of it. So if you agree with those premises, it's not marginal tinkering to the system. It's changing the fundamental incentives of the system. But that system is the number one employer in the country and the number one money generator in the country. So when you go to any city in America and look at people's houses, their dignity and their lives, it's a lot of those people, it's funded by this broken system, to be just direct. So it is a very scary thing, actually. Unwinding this system to the degree that I think actually mathematically has to be done eventually, I don't see how it doesn't cause a lot of short-term economic carnage, to be frank. I think it's necessary for our long-term competitiveness, because I think it actually is alarming what's happening to our physical and mental health. And again, we're losing the ability to reproduce, which I couldn't imagine a bigger alarm signal from our biology than that. It's our core evolutionary function for being on the earth. But So that's what I'd say. I am optimistic because your listeners, millions of people are waking up and I think realizing, that we need to change and there is a bottoms up revolution. I am pessimistic because I don't see a way that this doesn't cause mass economic dislocation in the short to medium term.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm getting at. The fact that for good and bad, the solution to this is cheap and simple. If people start moving their bodies and start eating whole foods, they're going to be well on their way to getting to what we're talking about, fixing their metabolic health. So that's not going to create a lot of jobs, and that's not going to stimulate the economy. And a lot of everything, like you said, that you gave the example there when people go back to their house, a lot of this is built on this system we're talking about. So I don't see a way out without a lot of pain along the way because we're so far down the line, and the solution doesn't involve a lot of spending and a lot of complexity.
Yeah, well, I would just say that I think it is the solve for our long-term economic growth and competitiveness because the economy is nothing other than the inputs are humans. And right now, systematically, Americans are not at their best. When you look at the 80% of American adults being overweight or obese, obesity isn't the problem per se. Obesity is a visible sign that the person's cells are malfunctioning. 20% of our energy is produced in our head, right? The relation between metabolic dysfunction, diabetes, obesity, and depression is very clear, right? Diabetes, obesity, those are signs of metabolic dysfunction. But when you have metabolic dysfunction, it means, again, 20% of your energy, your metabolism is in your brain. It literally most likely means your brain is not being powered correctly. And there's increasing science coming out that mental health disorders are very, very metabolically tied, and tied relatedly to our gut and our microbiome, which is heavily influenced by our food. So I think actually we're going to decline economically if we don't understand that we're systematically, basically committing suicide against the inputs of the economy, which is humans and the brains of humans. I actually think getting health better and health right and understanding that we can't have a population that we're poisoning and expect to have long-term economic competitiveness. Understanding that's important. It's going to cause short-term issues, but I think it's the long-term thing that's, it's just simple. We have to stop poisoning our population to probably achieve ultimate American competitiveness, in my opinion.
And another way of looking at it is the success and the general health of society, not metabolically, but from the American perspective, from the world's perspective, what's going on in North America is a success with the way things are running and the success of the nation. What I'm getting at, the other way of looking at that is at a cost. It's actually not real. When you see the economy and I'm no expert in this, but when you see, the US being this world power and having all this power and prestige and success, maybe that just isn't real. And maybe that is just for the last, who knows, 100 years has just been built on a house of cards. And that, when this falls apart, it's just going to reveal what's been there. And this money and the success really isn't anything tangible.
100%. I think I think we've lost our way by not understanding that the foundation of public policy should be the health and happiness of individual citizens. That if that's prioritized first, then good outputs will come for society and from that. But yeah, I think it does get to a spiritual thing where some of the largest industries in the country profit off people being addicted and sick. Those interests have been really able to, let's not be conspiratorial, just be factual. Again, they are the largest funders to government. They are the largest funders to news. They are the largest funders to medical organizations. They're the largest funders to civil rights groups. They're the largest funders to almost every institution that we trust. And And again, their core economic imperative is for us to be addicted and sick and in fear and not trusting our own bodies, but trusting them. So unwinding that, I just cannot imagine a more pressing public policy need. And the public policy, from the top down, getting to solutions a little bit is, to me, very simple. We need to stop recommending poison, and we need to stop subsidizing poison. We recommend the wrong things from our government agencies, and we subsidize ultra-processed food, sugar, hundreds of billions of dollars per year, and obviously subsidize pharmaceutical interventions, which are neutral to negative, I'd say, on most indicators, in my opinion, and we don't incentivize actual medicine, true medicine, which is exercise, food, sleep, sunlight, chronic stress management, true things that like relieve the underlying cause of most disease. We don't subsidize that. So we need to subsidize the right things, and we need to stop recommending poison.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
The medical system has been an absolute abomination at chronic conditions, which lead to over 80% of U.S. deaths and lead to over 80% of U.S. healthcare costs. That is the conditions like obesity, like